Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us in this powerful educational Lunch and Learn, brought to you by Family Partners of Morris and Sussex counties. The topic for today is brought to you by Benjamin David from the Division of Child Protection and Permanency, also known as DCP&P. And with that, let's give a big welcome to Benjamin.
Well, thank you very much, Patricia. And again, I apologize to everybody who here was patiently waiting for me. And I see I got a couple of my coworkers on here. So how are you, Liz? How are you, Nicole? Hope you're both doing well. And today, so I'm going to talk a little bit about what happens when we make a referral to DCP&P and kind of what that looks like for us. And we'll talk a little bit about being a mandated reporter and kind of how it looks like making a referral to DCP&P in 2024. And then at the end, we'll, of course, leave some time for my coworker, Liz, because she has an important message about resource families and the need in the community to develop more resource families for our siblings, for our sets of siblings, and for our teenage kids that need a forever home or just a temporary placement. So we'll leave some time for her to do her thing too. So first things first, let's all talk about being a mandated reporter. Many of us work with children, and because we work with children, right, we're automatically mandated reporters of abuse and neglect, meaning that if we had a suspicion of abuse or child abuse or neglect, we're obligated to make that call to the hotline, 877-NJ-ABUSE, right? But there is a little known law in New Jersey that not just people who are working with children are mandated reporters. Actually, everybody, every citizen in the state of New Jersey is a mandated reporter. And again, what that means is that if you have a suspicion of abuse or neglect, you are obligated to call New Jersey's child abuse hotline. And again, that number is 877-NJ-ABUSE. Failure to report that suspicion, and though I say this, I have never actually seen somebody charged, but failure to report that suspicion could result in a criminal and misdemeanor type of charge. Now, again, I have never seen anybody charged, but the seriousness behind the law is there. And we really encourage people in the state of New Jersey to make that call and to allow the experts, us DCP&P workers, to make that determination of child abuse and neglect. Now, New Jersey's welfare system has gone through a tremendous amount of change these last decade or two. And New Jersey's child welfare system is one of the best in the state. And its system is designed, it's an open system, and it's designed for people, and it encourages people to call in to that hotline with that suspicion. Now, what does that call to the hotline look like? I do a lot of these presentations, and the overwhelming questions I get are questions about that process of contacting the hotline. Now, when you contact the hotline, you're going to be speaking to a trained social worker. And that trained social worker is going to ask you a series of questions that you may not have the answer to. And guess what? That's okay. Your obligation when you call the New Jersey Abuse Hotline is to provide as much information as you can about that allegation of abuse or neglect. And including in that allegation of abuse and neglect is information about the parents, their demographic information, their address, their phone numbers, any sort of contact information or information about that family that you have is absolutely relevant to that report. And again, you're going to make that report about the allegation of abuse and neglect in conjunction with all this other identifying information. Now, that social worker, again, is going to ask you questions about drug abuse, alcohol use, human trafficking, maybe violence in the home. And those are questions that our social workers are trained to ask every single family on every single call to the hotline. So it's not personal, and it's not geared towards you as an individual. It's just part of our process. And again, it's okay if you don't have the answers to those questions. Matter of fact, we probably anticipate you not having the answers to the questions. And then if you don't, you just simply say, I don't know. And you know now that that's okay. And you know now that those questions are going to be asked on just about every single call that comes into the hotline. So you report your information. You're going to provide as much information as you can about that family. Now, a couple of things that you need to know about that call. Now, the call will tell you that it's going to be recorded. And that recording does get sent up to the local office Every county has a local office. Sometimes there are multiple offices in the county. So that allegation will get sent up to the appropriate county, and then that worker or supervisor will be able to click on a link and listen to that recording. So it's important to know that you are being recorded. It's also important to know that when you make that call to the hotline, that it's confidential, meaning that that information, although recorded, stays between you and the social worker, and is not disseminated to anybody for any reason unless there's a court order involved, which rarely ever happens. So the point in me telling you that is when you make that call to the hotline, you know that your information is confidential and is kept within our system. At no point will our workers or will our social workers reveal to the family or to anybody else who made that call to the hotline. Now, I say that, but a lot of times families play detective and are able to determine based on circumstances, based on questions, who made the call, or they think they know who made the call. But I can tell you that none of our people are ever disseminating that information, and we're obligated by law to keep that information confidential. So your report to the hotline is confidential, although recorded, and although that recording does get sent up to the worker to listen to, it is confidential. And at no point do we tell the family or anybody else who made that call to the division. So you make that call to the division. You know now that you're reported. You know now that a recording is going to be sent up and that all the information is confidential. You know now that the social worker down in Trenton, and this is an important piece too, when all calls in New Jersey, they get funneled into one centralized location. Now in DCP&P world, it's known as SER, otherwise known as central screening. Central screening is where all these intakes go, and it's really just a giant room, and there's a bunch of social workers sectioned off, and it's their job to take in calls all as part of their shift, and they're trained to do so. But it's an important piece of our open system that I identified earlier, that all calls get funneled into this one centralized location where social workers are trained to handle and ask those questions that we talked about briefly before. So confidential. You can remain anonymous. There's another portion of this. No, we encourage you not to remain anonymous just in case we need to reach out to you for additional information or information in the future. And we encourage people to leave their contact information if they are making a report. We do understand the uneasiness of making a report, and sometimes people don't want families to know who called, so they too want to remain anonymous. That is okay as part of the process. We do prefer that you leave your name and contact information, but of course we understand the idea of wanting to remain anonymous. Some people do feel like that information gets disseminated or families can figure it out, and we definitely understand that. But no, that information is confidential, and it never gets disseminated. But to my point earlier, you can remain anonymous if you so choose. So those calls, you can remain anonymous. Those calls are recorded. A recording gets sent up. They're confidential. The social worker is going to ask you a bunch of questions, and it's okay if you don't know the answers to those questions, right? You are going to report as much information about the allegation and about the family as you know, including any demographic information, including any information on their culture, their address, their way of living, anything that you may know that may help that investigation. After the social worker asks you a bunch of questions and a series of questions, they're most likely going to put you on hold. And at that time, they're going to conference the case with the supervisor or someone that they're going to discuss and conference the case with. After that, they're going to come back to you and they're going to give you a coding of the case in a time frame. If they code the case CPS, you know that CPS refers to an allegation of abuse and neglect. Okay, and that's important because it allows us to do and conduct it allows us to conduct the investigation in a certain way. Now, the other type of coding the allegation will get will be a CWS, which is known as a child welfare assessment. That simply means, in the best way I can describe it for you guys, is that there is no allegation of abuse and neglect, rather an assessment by us of the family to see if we can provide services or to see if something is abuse or neglect going on. That is not an allegation of abuse and neglect. And that's important because, like I said earlier, with those CPS referrals, we have certain, we're protected by law to complete certain things, meaning we're allowed to go to a child's school on a CPS referral, right? We cannot do that on a CWS referral, right? We are required to get collateral information on CPS referrals, which is information from service providers, schools, doctors who are involved with that family. We may do that on a CPS, but there is no obligation there. So there are differences within a CPS and a CWS that are relevant and pertinent to us. But the main distinction for you guys is that with a CPS referral, there are no concerns of abuse and neglect. CPS gets coded simply as CPS, allegations of abuse and neglect, and a CWS simply is that, a CWS. Now, a CWS, no allegation of abuse or neglect, will get responded to in 72 hours time frame. A CPS referrals get responded to in 2 time frames, either an immediate time frame, which means before the end of business on days that we are open, or on after hours or our days that we are closed, within 2 to 3 hours, we're making contact with that family. And that's an immediate coding. And that immediate time frame essentially means that we, according to our policy and procedures, have deemed that that child's safety requires an immediate response. Now, the other time frame that we respond to is 24 hours. So you have the immediate response where we deem that that child's safety requires an immediate response, an assessment to determine if that child is safe or unsafe, or 24 hours where we're still making that determination of whether or not that child is safe or unsafe, but the allegation doesn't require us to go out on an immediate basis to complete that assessment. So you have the 24-hour time frame and you have the immediate time frame. Regardless of the time frame, our investigation requires us to meet with the alleged child victims first. Now, that means the person who called the hotline, they're alleging Johnny Smith was physically abused by their parent, right? That makes Johnny Smith the alleged child victim. And in that instance, and in some instances, there could be more than one alleged child victim. There could be multiple, but we're meeting with the alleged child victim first. In the event that there are other children in the home, but they are not alleged to have been neglected or abused, we are meeting with them second. So it's the alleged child victims first, and then other children involved in the home next. After that, we are meeting with the non-offending parent, which means the child is alleged to have been abused or neglected by a parent or guardian. If it's just one, we are meeting with the other one first. And then we meet with the alleged perpetrator of abuse and neglect, the person who is alleged to have done the abuse and neglect, if you will. So that's kind of the order that we go in. Our first interaction is always unannounced, meaning that the parents or caregivers do not know that our first interaction is coming. Like I said, it is unannounced. Subsequent interactions may very well be announced, but they also may be unannounced depending on the situation. Now, we absolutely want to engage our families. We want to support our families. And this is one of the biggest changes that since I've definitely been with the division is we are more of a support for families now. We want to engage families. We want to make sure families are linked to community resources when it's applicable and appropriate. We want to, of course, make sure kids are safe. That is our number one priority. But then after that assessment of safety, like I said, we want to connect families to the community. We want to develop family supports with them and community supports with them. We don't, as an agency, want to be involved with families on a long-term basis. We want to develop strengths with families and supports for families. So if and when there's a crisis or if and when there's a situation in the future, they have the ability through their own means and to handle that challenge and to handle that difficulty without the division getting involved. And that really is our philosophy now. It's about connecting families. It's about uplifting and supporting families and encouraging them to minimize any abuse or neglect by engaging in community supports. Now, listen, are there times when kids are assessed by our social workers as unsafe? Yes, there are times when they're assessed as unsafe. And at that time, it's our obligation to make sure that children are safe. Now, our first priority is to ensure that children are safe by using family supports that they identify in the community. If we can't do that, if we can't work with the family to minimize any of the abuse and neglect, in the rare circumstances in 2024 that we can't do that, then yes, we do have the ability to remove kids from their care. But I can tell you that that is absolutely the last resort and is not something that we do or take lightly. It is something that is conferenced and discussed, and it is something that we do only to ensure child safety. And again, our first priority is child safety, but we want to do that with the family and with the supports identified by the family in conjunction with community supports and community resources. And I hope that makes sense. And that's just the philosophy. Remember, I said New Jersey's one of the best child protection systems in the country. And that is one of the philosophies that we have. We don't want to remove children. We don't want to be involved with families on a long-term basis. We want to support and uplift and encourage families, like I said earlier, to minimize any abuse and neglect concerns, and to really kind of handle those challenges on their own. So it's a breath of fresh air, really. It's a great philosophy, and I think our families are really benefiting from that philosophical change within our agency. And I know a lot of us, if you're a little bit older, you may even call us and refer to us as DIFUS, right? And that was our old name. And we have now since, and this is going back, this has been years now. We are Division of Child Protection and Permanency, and that new change in name, indicates a new philosophy and a new way of doing things. And that name, brings about a new perspective and a new feeling. And that new perspective is kind of what I just mentioned: is working with families and really kind of developing strengths and supports so they can manage the difficulties that they endure on their own and not necessarily have to get involved with the division. I hope that makes sense. So any questions so far? I know I talk a lot, and I know I could talk about this stuff all day and forever, but please interrupt if you have any questions. Anybody?
Ben, I also want to remind everybody that we're going to have the contact information, website, and everything in the description box below the video. So in case if they didn't have time to get the phone number, so that information is going to be there. So don't worry about that.
And to your point too, Patricia, yes, you guys, if you have any questions that don't pop up now, or you don't feel comfortable asking questions in this forum, you could always, I'll leave my phone number. You could always email me or call me. And like I tell everybody when we do presentations, if you have a question or if you have a concern or you have a situation that you're unsure of and you want to just talk it out, I'm always available to have that dialogue and to have that discussion. A lot of schools reach out with these certain types of situations and we talk it through. Now, to be 100% honest with you, a lot of times it ends up with the person calling the division or calling the hotline. But like I said earlier, that just goes back to allowing us as the experts to ensure child safety and to make sure that there are no concerns of abuse and neglect. So I am absolutely willing to have that dialogue. To your point, Tricia, just I'll make sure that I have my contact information in the chat.
I also want to remind everybody that we are going to allow time for Q&A, and that part is not recorded. So, if you don't feel comfortable asking questions now, you're going to have time to ask any question to Ben.
Go. So we talked about what happens when we make that call, right? You have that concern of abuse and neglect. You have that suspicion. You know that there's law that not only mandates that you report, but also protects you. It protects your anonymity. It protects the information that you're reporting, right? So you have that protection. After you make that call to that one location, right? All those calls get funneled into that one centralized location in New Jersey, our open system that we talked about. The social worker is going to ask you a series of questions. You're going to report the information you know. They're also going to ask you a bunch of questions that you don't know, right? Or you may not know, and that's okay. You just simply reply that you don't know. You know now that that call is going to be coded in two different ways for the most part, that CWS and that CPS. You know now that CPS refers to an allegation of abuse and neglect, and that allows division workers certain liberties and privileges that a CWS does not. In terms of how we complete our investigation and what we're allowed to do and what we're not allowed to do by law. You know now that CPSs get responded to in an immediate time frame or a 24-hour time frame. You know now that CWSs get responded to in a 72 hours or a 3-day time frame. And you know now that CWSs do not have any allegations of abuse or neglect. So that's a lot of information that we covered in just 30 minutes. Look at that. That's cool. You also know now, right, that case or that allegation is going to get sent to an investigator. That investigator is going to complete that investigation. They're going to speak to the alleged child victim first. They're going to speak to any other children next, the non-offending parent, and then that alleged perpetrator like we talked about. So everybody in that house is getting spoken to and seen and interviewed, right? And that's our state's policies and procedures and how we complete our investigation. Now, I had talked about concerns, not concerns of abuse. Well, yeah. So concerns of abuse or neglect. When our intake worker goes out and says, yes, I have identified a concern of abuse and neglect as it relates to New Jersey's policies and procedures, right? So, and that's an important distinction because a lot of us can go out to a home and it may not meet our personal standards of living and our personal requirements of parenting, but that's not what we make our assessment and our judgments by. New Jersey has set forth policies that every worker is obligated to adhere to, and we make our assessments in conjunction with those policies. So as long as what is going on in that family situation does not meet the criteria, in a lot of instances it doesn't, that means there's no abuse or neglect occurring, and 9 out of 10 times we close those cases at the intake level, meaning that the investigation came in, the intake worker completed their investigation, and then they terminated their involvement. Now, here's an important part. If we, as an agency and as an intake worker, identify a concern or abuse or neglect, including making a determination that that child is unsafe, right? If that happens, well, then that case will get transferred to a permanency worker where that worker will work with that family on an ongoing basis. So this is the distinction I want to make. Remember how we talked about New Jersey's welfare system is open and we encourage people to call? Well, because of that open system and because of that encouragement, anybody with children can really have an active intake, an investigation that somebody is investigating you because somebody called the hotline. Not everybody will have an open DCP&P case. An open DCP&P case refers to the transfer of that case, right? An identified concern of abuse and neglect and an ongoing presence from DCP&P. An open case does not mean an active investigation. There's a huge difference. Any one of us with children, like I said, can have an active investigation. If you get into a fight with a neighbor, if somebody doesn't like you, if you do something out to somebody and they decide to be vindictive and call you back and say, hey, something's going on at Miss Houston's house. I saw her do this, that, and the third. Well, our social workers are going to gather that information. And remember, if it meets our standards, then it's going to be an investigation, an active investigation. However, when the social worker goes out to Miss Houston's house, right, and sees that everything's fine, they would close that case. If in the case that there was a concern, right, then that case is now open for services. And I hope I made that clear. And I hope you guys understand that distinction, because there is a huge distinction. Like I said, anybody can have an active DCP&P case. Not everybody will have an open DCP&P case. An open DCP&P case means a DCP&P worker has identified a concern of abuse or neglect, and we as an agency need to mitigate that concern by providing services to that family. I hope that makes sense. And that's important because we get, as an office, anywhere from 90 to 110, around 100 a month intakes. So we have anywhere about 15, 16, 17, give or take, investigators that go out monthly who take these allegations of abuse or neglect. So these are coming in every month is my point, and only a small percentage of them will get transferred with identified of abuse or neglect. The vast majority of those cases will get closed out at the intake level after the investigator engages with the family and ensures that they are connected to the community. Does that make sense?
Ben, and thank you very much for elaborating on that. What would you say for those individuals that might be a little hesitating about making those phone calls because they don't know if that's the right thing to do? What would you say to that?
I would say that is a question I get a lot. And about it being the right thing to do, it always goes back to the child's safety. Okay, is what's going on, one, impacting the child, and two, is what's going on making that child unsafe? And if the answer to those questions is if the answer to those questions is a yes, then you absolutely have to make that call. If you don't know, and the likelihood is that you don't know the impact of it on the child, well, then I'm going to encourage you to err on the side of caution and allow us to make that determination. I'm also going to tell you that there's nothing stopping workers or agency employees from reaching out to the family and contacting mom and dad and having an open discussion with them about their concerns. A lot of times we're fearful or we don't want to have that interaction with families, and that's understandable. But a lot of times, especially as a previous intake worker myself, a lot of times if you just have open discussions with families, a lot of times questions can be answered. And those concerns can be minimized if you just have that open discussion with families. So if a worker has a concern with a mom or a dad or a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle, they have that ability to reach out to that parent and say, hey, I had this concern, I had this information came across my desk. Can you tell me about it? And at that point, if the concerns are greater or the concern isn't mitigated at all, then you can always reach out to our system and make that allegation to the hotline. A lot of times, people don't, they're wavering back and forth about making the call. And if they just place the call to the family first, then, they're not wavering anymore, because a lot of times they got the information that they need to help them make that decision. And a lot of times it's, yes, okay, I need to make that call now that I know that. Or no, I don't need to make the call now that I know that. And I'm going to give you an example. Johnny comes in and says his uncle got intoxicated and got into a fight with his girlfriend, but the uncle doesn't live there. But so the uncle, the child comes in and says this to the guidance counselor, right? And the guidance counselor just picks up the hotline and says, yeah, Johnny came in and said his uncle was intoxicated. They got into a fight and it was just a bad situation over Saturday night. However, and then we take that because that's concerning. We need to make sure all the things, right? And then we go out there and we talk to mom and dad, only to find out that the uncle lives in Georgia and was only visiting that day, right? So had the person took that information and made the call to the family, right, we would have known that the uncle lives in Georgia. We would have addressed the concern with the family, and then we wouldn't have had to necessarily make that call to the hotline. So that's an instance where we can mitigate the abuse or neglect concerns ourselves without calling the hotline and just by making that phone call to the family. Now, I am always going to encourage and suggest that if you are uncomfortable making that call or having that dialogue and you're unsure of the impact, well, then you're going to err on the side of caution and you're going to allow us as the experts to make that determination of abuse and neglect.
Thank you very much for the clarification. Shortly, we are going to move to our Q&A session, but before that, Ben, any final thoughts that you would like to share with us?
No, I appreciate you guys listening. And I think the point I want to get home is, especially that in 2024, we are not a punitive agency at all. We want to support families. We want to uplift families. We want to encourage families to connect them with their supports, with the people and family that they identify as their supports. And then, of course, within the community. We get a bad rap and we have a bad reputation because sometimes we do have to get involved in custody issues and make sure children are safe. But the vast majority of our interactions are positive. And again, we want to have open discussions with family. We want to work with families to encourage and build them up, to make sure that they're connected within the community and then can handle any inevitable difficulties by themselves and with their supports.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And once again, I just want to thank everybody for joining us, and to you, Benjamin, for being here with us and taking the time to do this presentation. And with that, we are going to move to our Q&A session. That part is not recorded. Thank you very much.